Welcome, everyone. The Jason Institute for Peace and Security is delighted to welcome Dr. Joris Larik. He is an assistant professor of comparative EU and international law at Leiden University. He's also an expert in EU external relations law and global governance. Today, we will be discussing the report of the expert group on the humanitarian intervention and political support for the interstate use of force. Welcome, Dr. Larik. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we are delighted to have you here as well. So recently, last year, or in 2019, on April 25th, Stef Blok, the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs, requested the formation of this particular expert group to give their advice on the political support and humanitarian intervention for interstate use of force. When you received the request from the minister about conducting this research into this topic, what was the process of forming this group? What role did you exactly play?
Yes, so I came into this, I think it was June 2019, so there was already the decision you referred to by the minister of earlier in that year establishing the expert group. So the nine members, including the chairman, Professor Cyril Feyenoord, and then together with a colleague from the Klingendahl Institute, Nienke van Heukelingen, and myself, we then, with the chairman, constituted the Secretariat of the expert group. How the process for this went, so there was a kind of a vetting process, so to speak. The chairman reached out to me. We had a meeting, I think 2 meetings, just to see, could we work together well? We hadn't worked together before. We were actually as a secretariat, quite a mixed group. So he's more from the internal security, criminology, police side of things, but has written many reports on issues of national security. I'm more, as you said, from the international law and international relations side of things, and Deputy Secretary Nienke from European Parliament, also EU foreign policy, but then more the political aspects of it. And we hadn't worked before with each other, so we got to know each other first a little bit, but yeah, that all went very well. And we really started working then right away from June onwards as the Secretariat.
Okay, but were there any specific instructions were given to you from the Dutch Foreign Ministry in what sort of researchers you should be looking into and what kind of people should be involved in a bigger group sense?
Well, yeah, here I should also say this was an independent expert group. And of course, I should also preface this with this big disclaimer that as the deliberations of the expert group itself, they are of course confidential, and I won't discuss those for that obvious reason. So everything I say here basically it's about the report itself, or in a personal or academic capacity. But yeah, the expert group itself, all of us were then in independent capacity. So it's in that sense you're different from, let's say, someone who works for the foreign ministry or is a legal advisor there. It was the government really wanted to know our assessment as a mixed group. I think as a secretary, the secretary of the expert group, the task was in particular background research, and then writing background notes together with the chairman, and then help to consolidate the input from the expert group itself into a report, share that again with the experts, consolidate their feedback, find compromise solutions, again together with the chairman, editing, translating, all these kinds of tasks. So also for me as an academic, that was quite different, because normally you're supposed to bring your own argument, your own point of view is supposed to be front and center in your books and articles. Whereas here, there I really needed to take a step back from that. So as the secretary, you don't have an opinion of your own, but you're there to facilitate and help synthesize the collective opinion of the expert group. And there I can also say it was certainly challenging, because it was a mixed group, but that was also something that was specifically wished for by the Dutch government. So they wanted an expert group that is both interdisciplinary, so not just lawyers, not just diplomats, not just international relations or security people, but a mix of these 3 groups, and also an international group. So not just Dutch experts, but Dutch and from other countries. So we also had colleagues from the UK, from Denmark, Germany, and the US represented in the group as well. So that made it then, I think, all the more important to find a way to combine these different views into one coherent report that the government then can work with.
Yeah, having this such an interdisciplinary and international group, what was the main objectives of the report at hand then?
I think the government really wanted something that's useful for them for the specific question of how to deal with situations where maybe the government wants to support or is inclined to support particular interventions by others, by allies, most likely, but where there's concerns about the international legality of these actions. So the really specific prompt for this was the chemical weapons attacks in the Syrian conflict, which were then, or as a response to that, that was in 2018 when France, the UK, and the US led these airstrikes against targets, chemical weapons facilities in Syria.
Good evening. The North Atlantic Council has just met. France, the United Kingdom, and the United States briefed allies on their joint military action in Syria overnight. All NATO allies expressed their full support for the last night's actions.
So that was something that most commentators would say is illegal under international law. This wasn't authorized by the Security Council, but happened nonetheless. Most NATO allies supported this quite openly, and the Netherlands was more hesitant, also because of its own national guidance. So this is the other prompt of this, a bit further back in history. After the Iraq War, the Davids report of 2010, when that came out, said, well, from now on, please don't support anything anymore politically that's blatantly illegal under international law, which the Iraq War was. It's very hard to say that it wasn't. So that was the current guidance. And now we're faced with a more recent situation where if you followed the Davids guidelines very strictly, the Dutch government couldn't support it. And they didn't. They said they had understanding for it. So the famous Dutch word, begrip, that they expressed also in the North Atlantic Council. So they weren't in a position to fully support this, but it prompted them to think that, okay, maybe there are situations where we should be able to do this. But before we change our policy again, let's get experts to write a new report basically on this particular question.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of observed made an observation in the report that the Dutch government really did struggle in supporting the military response of its allies, specifically by the parliamentary debates given by Minister Blok and showing the difference between understanding and the political support, and it came back in the report itself. For instance, in the Minister Blok asked specifically two questions to the expert group. First, regarding the humanitarian legal basis, and the second was the political support for such interstate use of force. In my understanding, the use of force is prohibited under Chapter 7 of UN Charter, unless, as you have mentioned, the Security Council has to authorize it, or it has to be self-defense. However, the Minister Blok asked specifically whether the government should strive for international acceptance for humanitarian intervention as a new legal basis for the use of force regarding interstate. What were the conclusions? What was the conclusion that the expert group came into about this question?
Yes, one thing you can see from the report itself is one of the first things the group did was flip the two questions. Because the one of should the Netherlands push for internationally for a new exception? So finding another way to get around, let's say, the prohibition to use force in international law. That was seen as something so systemic, something so fundamental that should be tackled first. It also informs the answer to what was originally the first question. So under which criteria should you politically support interstate use of force? Depends very much on the scope of exceptions that exist. And I think generally what you can see also, the Netherlands does take international law very seriously. it's even in the Constitution in Article 90 to develop the international legal order. But here was the question, how do you want to do that? Should you do that in this particular case that doesn't need this kind of radical reform? And also, which chances of success does that have? So, so there the group decided to flip the two questions, and that's why they're in the report also treated in the reverse order. And also, yeah, regarding that question, so should a new exception be developed? There was a vast majority in the group that said no, that should not be pursued. So that's quite clear, resounding no answer to that question. For a number of reasons that are listed there, but maybe some of the most important ones of which are that, yeah, the prohibition to use force is really one of the cornerstones of modern international relations, and that shouldn't be eroded further, maybe especially from a country like the Netherlands, that shouldn't be done. And also, yeah, that it would be set a very bad precedent, invite other countries that maybe don't share the Netherlands' values and interests to make use of such a new exception. And just generally that there wouldn't be much appetite in the international community to do that. So that's just some of the reasons the report mentions as well, not to do that. At the same time, there was also a minority opinion in the report that is mentioned, that states that there might already be a very limited exception looking at state practice in extreme humanitarian disasters, catastrophes, think of genocide and the like, to intervene, and that also then should suggest that the Netherlands should pursue that, or at least discuss such an exception with its allies, or more broadly with partners internationally. But yeah, really the majority opinion of the report is really no, don't pursue a new exception to the prohibition to use force.
Yeah. In that case, there was you have mentioned that you have the Davids committee who said do not give political support when it comes to more interventions without having a legal basis. To what extent the Srebrenica war and the Iraq war, in which both the Netherlands was actively involved, had an impact in trying to come to this decision for Syrian intervention?
No, that was really the guiding principle that really shaped Dutch policy ever since, certainly the Davids report that was then adopted as official Dutch policy afterwards. So that was from about 2010 that was the case. And yeah, as you said, the Netherlands did support the Iraq war, even though it was quite blatantly illegal. And I think they didn't want a scenario like that again in the future. But yeah, if you look then at the airstrikes against Syrian chemical weapons facilities in 2018, it's not quite the same. So it's not a fully fledged invasion of another country. It's didn't have quite the, let's say, international controversy, or it was controversial, but not the same as the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Nonetheless, what the two have in common is that it's neither self-defense, which was the other existing exception, nor authorized by the Security Council. So yeah, this is then where the Dutch government thought, well, maybe we should reconsider the very strict position that we had post-Davids, but still not go to the other extreme right away either, to say, okay, we support all these kinds of things, and we still think that we should take international law, and especially that aspect of it, very seriously.
Yeah. I'm going to touch upon R2P, responsible to protect. In justifying the military response, the US specifically mentioned that it was a legitimate, proportionate, and justified. More importantly, it was necessary, because chemical weapons are a unique danger to civilized nations because of the brutality, but it can cause huge devastation.
My fellow Americans, a short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom is now underway. We thank them both.
Let me set out why we have taken this action. Last Saturday, up to 75 people, including young children, were killed in a despicable and barbaric attack in Douma, with as many as 500 further casualties. We have worked with our allies to establish what happened, and all the indications are that this was a chemical weapons attack. We are also clear about who was responsible for this atrocity. A significant body of information, including intelligence, indicates the Syrian regime is responsible for this latest attack.
The UK furthermore emphasized that the use of chemical weapons is a serious crime of international concern and it breaches customary international law, and it is a crime against humanity. The three pillars of responsibility to protect is the state responsibility, the assistance of the international community, and the intervention in the last resort, as a last resort of the international community. The Syrian intervention has these reflections of the R2P, the three pillars of R2P. And you have, however, it does not provide a legal basis for humanitarian intervention. And especially it has been criticized a lot in the wake of the Libyan intervention as well. What makes the idea of traditional humanitarian intervention so appealing as a legal basis compared to responsibility to protect? Although you have suggested in the report, you have encouraged the Dutch government to use R2P more actively. So where is that dilemma between humanitarian intervention as a legal basis and R2P as an alternative for a legal basis?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned R2P because it's been a very prominent concept in the last years, or for 2 decades now, ever since the report from 2001, the International Commission on response to the R2P report that came out then. And yeah, in the report, we also try to put these questions in that wider context, first of all, as just to show that this question needs to be seen also in light of these developments. So there is the R2P debate. There's also other things that are relevant here, such as initiatives to at least restrain the use of the veto in the Security Councils to make it perhaps a little bit easier to get authorizations from the Security Council to use force in blatant cases such as the use of chemical weapons, which you rightly point out that is manifestly illegal under international law. But what, let's say, humanitarian intervention and R2P both have in common is that neither provides a legal basis to use force under international law as it currently stands, or at least that would be the majority opinion also from the report. So that's something that needed to be pointed out as well. But doesn't mean that the Netherlands shouldn't be pursuing these other avenues as well. That's maybe something, if you don't go for promoting a new exception, at least promote then these other aspects that might at least prevent such atrocities in general in the future. Yeah. But what we needed to point out, or what was important to point out in the report as well, was that, yeah, R2P itself doesn't give you an exception by itself. And that was made very clear by the international community in its 2005 World Summit report, when they refer to R2P. So it endorsed that as a concept that also states acknowledge, find important, but at the same time saying the authority to authorize the use of force, that remains with the Security Council. So in that sense, it's not a way to sneak in a new exception to make things like humanitarian intervention legal. So R2P, it's still there. But it didn't provide for this additional exception. Okay.
So in that, because it doesn't offer a new legal basis, and use of force is only it has to be authorized by the UN Security Council. In the case of Syria, and this is where it gets one of the observation that has been made is that there wasn't a consensus when it came to the intervention itself. Russia and China kept vetoing the intervention because it stated it's illegal under international law. In your view, do you think that the power of the veto, the P5 system, should be changed to avoid the UNSC from enacting, like to have it more quick response during massive
Well, I do have some thoughts on that, but let me first start with also what the report said, and then what the Dutch government responded to this as well. So it was mentioned in the list of considerations. So now we're actually in the domain really of the second question already. So maybe sometimes you can support, you should support use of force, even if it's illegal. Do it so cautiously. So the main message of the report here. And consider also a number of circumstances, one of which is also why is it illegal? And one might be that, it has been vetoed in the Security Council, even though it is perhaps an overwhelming support of it from the international community otherwise. And this frustration of vetoing the use of force where it might be used or might be supported widely for causes also envisaged by the UN Charter, preventing genocide or things that are really manifestly illegal and cannot be stopped otherwise through other means. That is a frustration that you can see also in the cabinet in the government reaction to the report, where it's also noted that yes, the reason why some of these developments are illegal is because it was impossible to make them legal through Security Council authorization, because the Security Council gets blocked, gets vetoes are being exercised. And in the case of Syria, that's also just a matter of public record that Russia and China and Russia repeatedly vetoed resolutions with regard to the Syrian conflict and the chemical weapons question in particular.
Yeah. France, on the other hand, proposed to suspend the veto in the case of mass atrocities, and Netherlands actually supported that idea. Do you think is that feasible to do that as a solution for ensuring that the UN Security Council act quickly?
Yeah, so those were initiatives that the report also highlighted. So you have the French-Mexican initiative, and then the similar ACT initiative, accountability and transparency, and I think coherence initiative. So both aim at restraining the use of the veto through a non-binding code of conduct that would yet to have to be established, to just pressure permanent members of the Security Council to not do that. So if in the case of mass atrocities, for instance, to not exercise their veto. But the practicalities of that's quite difficult. So those initiatives have received a lot of support, and it's true the Netherlands supports that as well officially. But you first have to establish that code of conduct, and then what do you do to make sure that permanent members of the Security Council actually abide by it? Nonetheless, it's personally speaking, I think they're interesting initiatives because they do not require you to amend the charter. They're more a form of peer pressure. It's something that's a lot more feasible than amending the UN Charter, for instance. So it's certainly a worthwhile initiative from that point of view. And it's also a reminder that all members of the UN, including the permanent 5, are bound by the UN Charter and should make active contributions to pursuing its purposes and respect its principles. So in that sense, that's a good reminder of that. There's also some interesting nuances between those two initiatives. I don't want to go too much into detail, but I think the ACT initiative is a bit more wide-reaching, whereas I think the French-Mexican one is more focused on the P5 themselves and has some exceptions for vital national interests. So they're not exactly. So that's why we have these two parallel initiatives. So they're not exactly the same.
It is quite interesting how international relations work in practicality, because you have the expert group argued that, as you have already mentioned, that lending political support to interstate use of force is not always it's not advisable. However, it highlights that the Dutch government may contradict your advice if they have compelling reasons. So can you explain what kind of compelling reasons the Dutch government might have to kind of avert away from the advice of the expert group? Because they have done it, I believe, after the Srebrenica massacre as well, they have ignored a couple of the advice that given to them prior as well.
Well, I mean, it is advice, no more, no less. So it's the government that makes its own policies, and policies on their part are not laws. So they can also be amended by the government, and the government itself doesn't even need to abide by it in any particular situation. It's just you could have an expectation and presumption to follow your own guidance, and of course, if you deviate from that, that can be expected to be politically quite controversial as well. But yeah, I think this is maybe important to stress from the point of view of the national legal framework here. So there's no national law or even a constitutional law that would force the Dutch government to do this one way or the other on these particular questions, apart from Article 90 on developing the international legal order. But that can mean two things. I think that's something we see in the more general debate about that. Does this mean, it certainly means take international law seriously, but do you do that either by respecting it to the letter as it exists now, or to develop it further in terms of fixing some of the problems that we currently experience? Maybe the two aren't mutually exclusive most of the time, but yeah, in this particular question, they might be. So actually, there's quite some leeway here for the government to act. Also, recalling that it's not the Dutch government itself that actually intervened anywhere here. It's really the question, who do you then support to? But nonetheless, maybe on that note, let me also add that this itself is a sensitive question in terms of, does that lead to incurring what's called international legal responsibility for the Netherlands? So even if you support something, you can, under certain circumstances, be responsible under international law as well. And this is where the expert group draws that distinction between material support, weapons, money, these kinds of things, or political support. So something you express, for instance, at the UN or in public statements. And the report says it's that, so the latter element, the political support in itself, does not normally lead to international legal responsibility. But here's interesting to know, perhaps, that I think the Dutch government in its reaction to the report was even more cautious. So they said, well, that's the opinion of the expert group, but maybe there's international judges that might rule otherwise. So they're even more cautious in that regard as well. So well, which in a way brings us back to Article 90, that they do really take that very seriously, even though perhaps under national law they have actually quite a lot of policy space here to decide on these points.
So in the end, the Constitution is, the national framework is very important when it comes to deciding what they should do, what a government should do when it comes to have do international interventions or showing support, politically speaking.
Well, it's here, I think, really for the Netherlands, the international legal framework that's in this particular question the most important, because that's where we have that prohibition to use force and international responsibility questions. There's nothing in the Dutch constitution. I mean, you have some national constitutions like Japan or Germany that have a renunciation of war. You have kind of pacifism kind of put into the constitution itself, whereas that's not the case for the Dutch constitution. And generally, when it comes to these kind of international security questions, generally governments have a lot of leeway under national law to decide their own policies. So in the US, you might have heard of the whole commander-in-chief doctrine. That's maybe the strongest version of that. But most countries have something you could call, or that is called in the literature, foreign affairs exceptionalism. So where in these security-related questions, courts or even the parliament shouldn't interfere too much with what the government has to decide. And so that's now beyond what the report itself says, but something more I can share just for my academic background. But here it's quite interesting. It brings us back to the report in the sense that it does mention these different considerations that the government has to take into account, and that it does acknowledge that sometimes this is an international crisis situation normally that this would apply to, where you can't debate this in Parliament or wait for a court judgment for months and then make up your mind. You have to decide quickly with the best evidence available, although evidence is very important here. That's reliable and that should come out to be verified by your own administration. But yeah, it acknowledges that this needs to be done quickly, and that governments need to make a tough call here. Again, within their own policy framework, and hopefully something that respects international law to the fullest extent, where possible. But as we see here, that's sometimes not always. You can't have all these things all at the same time.
You have mentioned as the Netherlands should obviously collaborate or cooperate with the and talk more, have more discussions with the North Atlantic Council and NATO, with EU and all of its other allies, in to ensure like there's a proper uniformity when it comes to intervention or to the understanding that they're giving each other. So in that manner, how much is that important when it comes to within the international security discussion or the legal framework when it comes to humanitarian intervention, such as in Syria or in any other countries?
Yeah, the report stresses that at several instances. So both when it comes to promoting better international responses to atrocities, not necessarily promoting, or in the majority view, not promoting a new exception, but still talk to your NATO allies, your EU allies. They're mentioned a few times as well. And yeah, here we shouldn't forget that there's also the EU's common foreign and security policy, common security and defense policy. So that's, it should take place in that framework as well. But also with partners around the world. So that language, I think, is quite carefully chosen to, yes, talk to your allies, talk to your regional organization and your partners there, but also make this a real global conversation to make sure this isn't, I think you can also see, I think it's mentioned, certainly in the literature, that the Libya intervention was backfired in some ways, in the sense that there was argued then by others that NATO exceeded the mandate of the Security Council here, that this R2P was abused to take military action, and yeah, then immediately you're in a discourse about Western interventionism, militarism, maybe even some new colonial arguments that come into play.
The international community had to act. The violence unleashed against the people of Libya was...
That's where it comes from, or why the report also stresses that this should be a global conversation, and that's particularly important. And yeah, but coming back to allies and so NATO and EU, what you could see in response to the Syria airstrikes was, there were in the end you had the North Atlantic Council statement with the Dutch caveat, and from the EU you had a bit more of a vague statement about Syria. But on the legality of this of the airstrikes, there were very mixed, often very vague opinions across countries. And yeah, here I think such a dialogue will be particularly important to, in the future, have a better understanding of why do certain countries think this is legal, why do others think it's illegal, or but maybe should be legal, or others that think it's illegal and should stay illegal. So certainly among self-professed value communities such as the EU and NATO, it would certainly be desirable to have a more coherent approach to these really fundamental questions, and I think there is more work to be done. So on the one hand, yes, as I said earlier, you have to take tough calls in these crisis situations, but that then shouldn't prevent you, I would say, shouldn't prevent you from having a stronger dialogue in the longer term to maybe avoid also misunderstandings and divergences in the future.
When you finished the report, how long did it take actually to complete the entire report?
We were on a very tough time frame. I think that's fair to say. So there was, I think, 5-6 months to do this. So basically half a year from the establishment of the group and setting up the Secretariat, getting that up and running. There's one meeting of the expert group in October, and then on the 18th of December 2019, the report was handed over to the minister. And then he sent it on to Parliament. It was then Corona hit, so a lot of that then had to switch to online discussions. And then there was a government reaction to the report, and that's where we are. That's where we are now. A bit of debate in the media as well, and among parliamentarians, critical questions that were being raised. But so the whole process of the expert group itself, about half a year.
Wow.
Here again, you have to navigate between two extremes. So if this was an academic conference, you'd have the conference, people would be late handing in their papers, it would go into some peer review or editing process, maybe a book will come out 2 years later. Okay, for the government, you can't do that. Have they really wanted advice on this as quickly as possible. So you can't tell them, yes, we're going to write a nice academic book about this, and then 2 years later you get it. They wanted something faster than that. But still, yeah, you have to make sure it's academically rigorous. Yeah, as I noted earlier, it was a very mixed group. So in that sense, if it had only been international lawyers or international relations people, maybe it's a bit easier. But that report really was quite ambitious in the sense that it was supposed to combine these different perspectives, also within a very short time frame. So we had the expert group managed. We have a report with, I think, clear answers to the questions, but it's certainly a challenge to bridge these different disciplinary gaps in such a short amount of time.
In that case, what kind of policy implications do you think this report may have? Because you have mentioned that there have been debates going on in the parliament regarding this report and even in the media. So what kind of policy implications can we see in the future, possibly?
I think the main impact we've already seen in the government's appreciation of the report, where they endorse its findings, which of course is not something we aimed for. Again, it's an independent expert group, so it's up to the government whether they want to agree with it or not. But in this case, they did agree, I think, to a very large extent with the findings and the answers of the report. And in that sense, I think the policy of the Netherlands has shifted from what we had in the aftermath of the Davids report. So in that sense, we're now at I think the Dutch government policy is in that sense a little bit more nuanced. So in that sense, we're, I think, in between maybe the two extremes of what we had in the Iraq War, outright support from the Dutch government for an invasion of another country that was quite manifestly illegal, to then an enormously cautious approach or restrictive approach with the Davids report. I don't support anything ever that's against international law as it currently stands, to a more nuanced, cautiously and nuanced stance now. Yes, respect international law whenever possible, but under some extreme circumstances, you could consider politically supporting use of force by others, taking into account all the list of criteria that I mentioned in the report, and still pushing for international legality, most of the, overall as your general approach, but to at least carve out a small space of exception for situations like the airstrikes against Syrian counter-weapons facilities.
The last questions that I would like to ask is that many of us, many young students, university students, and young professionals are pretty much really would like to start, maybe get into this kind of field, into this kind of research expert groups, or may do a research in the future for themselves. Do you have any tips regarding those young professionals and students?
No, definitely. And first of all, let me say I applaud that, and I definitely can encourage young professionals to engage in this kind of work. I found this really one of the most enriching and rewarding experiences in my career so far. I really had the feeling that the expertise I built, and also some of the other skills that maybe don't seem so exciting when you study or when you start out in a job, editing and translating and doing a literature review, those kinds of things. But here, all of this I could really apply to something that was really, I thought, really important and relevant, a really current question, something that relates to national policy. Also an opportunity to really work with some amazing people, all the members of the expert group and the Secretariat, really, great team to work with, people to learn from. So definitely I can only encourage this kind of work. The second thing I'll say related to that is, some of these core skills really do pay off. So of course you need to have the subject matter expertise, but also, you need to be good at getting another understanding of a particular field quite quickly. I think that's not just in academic jobs the case, but also in a lot of government and think tank jobs. Be able to summarize that, synthesize that, be able to work as a team as well. Often as an academic, it's about just write your own thing, or maybe as a columnist, you write your own op-eds, but here to really synthesize sometimes a different group of different views and experiences. Be very meticulous. I think that's very important here as well, especially with this kind of work. It's the expert group's report. So whatever you edit, every single word or comma, you need to very carefully consider and cycle back to the members to make sure they're fine with that. You don't change the content in such a way that people disagree with it. So I think in that sense, yeah, it's really if you study and start out in a job, so some of these skills are extremely important. Maybe two other pieces of advice, if I may add as well, are definitely an interdisciplinary mindset are very important as well. So for me, for this group, it really turned out to be crucial that I'm specialized in international law and in foreign relations law, but also had studied international relations before as well. That came in extremely handy for this kind of mixed group that had to operate in a tight time frame and brought together different backgrounds. And last but certainly not least, also different language skills. So I think there's certainly today, and certainly in the Netherlands, there's this idea, okay, everything's in English anyway. Just read everything in English, learn to work in English, write in English as well, research in English. But I think this expert group work has really brought home for me how important it is to also know and be able to work in other languages. So, and I think to some extent it also helped me actually get into this position, because one particular consideration was what is going on in the national debates of the Netherlands' closest neighbors and allies, US, UK, but also France and Germany. And if you really want to understand that, you have to be able to read and understand those languages. And that was also quite rewarding, actually, very interesting to really read parliamentary debates, government texts and position papers in the original language. Then you really get a sense of what is going on in those countries. And it was also very important for this report then. And well, definitely last but not least, Dutch as well, or a national language. I think that goes for everyone. Also, don't forget about the importance of your own countries, or the country you work in, its own language, because that's where also the national debates take place, where these policy frameworks that's the language they're written in. So that all was really essential for this expert group report as well. Of course, the majority of the literature we consulted was in English in the end, given just the enormous amount of books and journals that you have. But don't forget about the other languages and the ability of being able to reach into national discourses, political and academic. It's really absolutely indispensable to get a sense of what's going on in these countries.
I think this is a very important remark that you have made, because language plays an important role when it comes to how we define our national borders and national security. So it is an important skill to have, to be able to speak that many languages and understand the discourses that is happening in each country. Saying that, I would really like to thank you for giving us some of your time for this beautiful interview, and I want to thank all our viewers as well. You can always go into Jason website and look up for new upcoming events, and the upcoming event is on January 28th, the Intelligence Behind Peace Missions, the UN mission in Mali, which is going to be held at 8 p.m. So with that, we're going to end this interview here right now. Thank you again so much, Dr. Larik.
No, thank you for this. Thank you.